Good morning, everyone. So I am Joars Alferez, Brother Joars, your professor. So this morning we'll be discussing about the introductory part of our course, conflict resolution, conflict management, as well as conflict transformation. The three words, resolution, management, as well as transformation, they are interrelated with each other. So while we journey in this course, you'll be familiar, you will know the details about these words. So as an introductory, so we move on. So it is said that all people desire to live in a world of peace and harmony. That's why all of us as peace educator, peace advocate, peacemaker, peace builder, and you studied Doctor of Peace and Philosophy, what we need nowadays in our world is the so-called peace and harmony. Then according to Buddha, you're familiar with Buddha. Buddha by the name of Siddhartha Gautama. Then as a philosophy about Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, he became Buddha, Buddha which means the enlightened one. Then he has a lot of followers. So he said, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Take note, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Kaya nga, nasa ating lahat. If we want peace, so therefore, it will start from within us, and therefore, maybe, later it would radiate to the whole world. Because for him, for Buddha, our thoughts, the way we think, is one way, according to him, that will be able to achieve the so-called peace, and we make the world. Then conflicts begins with an individual. There are arguments. Where does conflict begins? According to this author, he said, conflict begins within us. Because if you look at the picture, parang doble cara siya. The selfish as well as the unselfish one. I don't know if you'd agree with this idea. Yung the doble cara, there is good and there is bad in man. That's why according to one of the philosophers, he said, man is both good and bad. Then, in this case, conflict begins within the individual. UNESCO in the Constitution, especially in the preamble of the UNESCO, this is the introductory part of the Constitution, said, since wars begins in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So, ang gandang preamble, once again, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. If you notice, it is more or less related to what Buddha said. We are what we think. We made the world. In relation to this, since war begins in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. So if there are conflicts, so it's up to us to resolve those conflicts. Because tayo lang din gumagawa ng conflict. That's according to the Constitution. So in man, there are dual purpose. Diba? I told you in the previous slide, conflict begins from an individual. The selfishness as well as the unselfishness. So in man, we know very well, in your study, that man is composed of mind, the body, the mind, or the soul. Then, what's about the whole purpose of this man, as well as the self-purpose? So they are parang a cycle. Ikot-ikot yan sa tao yung the dual purpose, the mind and the body. So there are times our mind or body would interact. There are times may interaction. And there are times na maganda din yung daloy. There is coordination. Okay. Now, when we talk about the selfishness of men, take note of this. Living only for oneself. That's selfishness. Each one of us, we have that one. That's why in the beginning, man is, conflict starts within the individual because of the selfishness. An example of this yung living only for oneself. Lust. Biga. Alam natin yon. That's why, siguro an example, there are a lot. Kumbaga Cebuano, daghang bigaon ba? And this bigaon, this more on selfishness, walang disiplina. I don't know if you would agree with me, but if you have discipline, you have self-control, sabi ko nga, mas maganda pang hayop kasi may control. May nakita ka bang hayop pag hindi yung hit si babae? May nakita ang napataka ang hayop na lalaki? But tayo, we are given the intellect and the will. Minsan, especially tayo mga kalalakihan, aggressive. Makakita ng sexy, makakita ng 16 years old, na, minsan makalimutan ng asawa. I don't know if you'd agree with me. Because walang control. Because of this lust. Parang kita mo, this woman can satisfy my lust. Parang tipong ganon. And maybe because of this, not only man as aggressive, as well as itong the macho image, the macho mentality. So, ang problema ngayon, yan. Pumapasok yung biga na yan. Then, exploitation. What about exploitation? Why is it more on selfishness? I think you know that one very well. Exploitation, not only human exploitation, as well as our natural resources. Okay? That's unselfishness for the good of oneself. Prejudice. I think in your MA, you have a lot of discussion about prejudice or biases with each other. Then, greed, hakog, kasakiman. Sabi nga, minsan, ang mga tao daw parang unggoy. Look at the unggoy, the nature of the unggoy. Yung the greediness from the unggoy. Pag mahawakan yan, talagang hindi yan bibitawan. Sabi nga nila kung paano mahulihin ang unggoy, yung sa buko, butasan daw yung buko, lagyan pagkain, yung tama-tama makapasok yung kanyang makamay. Pag may mahawakan dyan, hindi na yan bibitaw. And that's a theory, and maybe it's true. Kasi ang unggoy is yung the greediness, sakim. Kaya nga, minsan may mga tao din mga unggoy, hindi naman nila lahat. Sana tayo, hindi tayo ganon. When we were still a child, di ba, mga anak natin, tinuturuan natin, nak, dapat magbigay ka, open arms, open hand, not ganyan. Kaya nga, pasok ditong corruption in our government, itong the greediness from within. Si Duterte, sabi niya, bago siya alis, the corruption. But we know very well, there are still a lot of corruptions in our government, in our administration today. Remember the PhilHealth? Billions ang pinag-usapan. Then, nagka-pandemic na wala ang issue. Saan na yun si General? Wala na. That's an example of the greediness within. Then, vengeance. Alam natin yung vengeance. In our land, we have the so-called rido. Buti na lang na medyo nabawas-bawasan na ngayon. Maybe because of this barm. But, nandyan pa rin, nag-exist yung iba, pero sana mawala na yan. Kasi that's more on selfishness. Sabi nga, pag nasasaktan yung tawag lang, maratabat. The term is maratabat. So, dapat gaganti yun. So, that's selfishness. Walang forgiveness. Then, arrogance. Dami yung mga taong arrogante, no? Alam natin yun. That's still selfishness. So, that's the other side of the individual, the selfishness. Next, what about the other side? Where conflict begins. The unselfishness or living for others. So sana tayo mga peace advocate, dito na tayo, peace educator, peacemaker, peace builder. Sana nag-level up, nag-transcend na tayo. More or less dito na tayo, living for others. Especially you, the police officers. Alam niyo yon, the unselfishness. You give your whole life to others. Whatever will happen, you give your life to the government, to the people, to protect us, the civilians. You know that one. That's why living for others, of course, may self-control ka na. Service, of course. Fairness. Generosity. What about generosity? Yung you give yourself to others without counting the cost. Hindi yung nagbibigay ka na naghihintay ng kapalit. Dapat nagbigay ka, lalo ng buhay mo, especially kayong mga pulis, hindi yan naghihintay ng kapalit. Kaya nga minsan, kung naintindihan mo, ako personally, I'm a civilian, pero minsan naawa din ako sa inyong mga pulis, your duty. Kung tinawag kayo sa duty ninyo, minsan maitsapwera, minsan ang pamilya. Because of this living for others. And of course, the opposite of vengeance is forgiveness. Forgiveness. Then, the next living for others is humility. Humility comes from the Latin word humus, which means soil. So, it reminds us once again, or we are reminded once again, that we came from that lupa. Kaya nga palagi tayong sinasabihan, yung mga tao medyang sumisikat, huwag kalimutan ha, na nakatungtong ka pa rin sa lupa. Because there are some, because of those unselfishness, nakapatong ng kalabaw, akala niya kalabaw na rin siya. So that's more on selfishness. But dito, on the other side naman, ito namang tinatawag nating the unselfishness. Na sana tayo, nandoon na tayo sa level na ito, the unselfishness. But if you will argue, hindi mo talaga maiwasan, but pwedeng maiwasan. You can prevent because we know. Kaya nga, if we know everything, we know how to balance. Balance lang yan. Okay? Sige, we move on. Mandela said, you're familiar with Mandela. The first thing is to be honest with yourself. You can never have an impact on society if you have not changed yourself. So that's a reminder to all of us. If we are selfish, if we are unselfish, but especially the selfishness within us. Ito yung sabi niya, once again, the first thing is to be honest with ourselves, with yourself. You can never have an impact on society if you have not changed yourself. Okay? I think that's self-explanatory. Then, there are so-called sources of conflict. By the way, there are a lot of sources of conflict. It depends to the authors. That's why, later I'll give you the topic siguro in our group chat. Bumabalik din ito, but it depends to the authors. But here with this research, I'll just cite some of the sources of conflict. The first is the spiritual sources of conflict. What about these spiritual sources of conflict? I think from the word spiritual, influences of the spiritual forces from God and negative influences. There are times in our life, as believer, I think all of us, wala namang itiya siguro dito, we are all believers. And there are times in our life na magka-crisis tayo with the different doctrines, with the different teachings. And minsan naman with our idea, with our ideology, with our philosophy in life. Minsan mag-away-away na din yan. Okay? Your spiritual as well as maybe the material, your idea. Okay. I think you would agree with me. Minsan may away, kaya nga papasok yung conflict. Then, another example, we have the so-called indigenous spirituality. And this indigenous spirituality, before Christianity came, before Islam came, and the other religion came in the Philippines, we have the so-called indigenous spirituality. And the IPs, they believe, itong animism, alaman natin yun sa history. Ito may Panginoon, ito wag galawin ang bato na ito ang sun may Panginoon. Itong mga halaman na ito, itong bundok na ito, until today, nag-i-exist yan. Then here comes, we were taught na in our Christian doctrine, or kung Muslim kan, in our Islamic doctrine, Islamic teaching, na dapat wala yun, mali yun, ganito. So with that, alin ngayon? Okay? So, may conflict spiritually. And there are also times in our life as believer, yung tinatawag natin spiritual dryness. Noon masigasig kang magsimba, magsambayang, but later, ano tong ginagawa ko? Routinary? Yung hindi pa nag-sink in at papasok yung spiritual sources of conflict. Okay? Ang daming issue dyan about the conflict of spirituality. Ang dami dyan. Especially with due respect to the others. Halimbawa, karamihan kasi ngayon sa mga Katoliko, pag makarinig na magagaling na pastors, magagaling na makumbinsi agad. Then sabihan, tingnan mo itong Katoliko, naniwala sa krus, sinasamba ang kahoy, mga ribulto. Pero hindi naman yung turo namin. Ito, representation lang. Pero here comes, rinig mo, ang galing ang makukonvince. Nasa kasi sa Bible, nakasulat talaga, do not curve images in Exodus, banatan ka kaagad. Then ikaw, very weak, ay tama pala siya, lipat na ako. So, the spiritual conflict, papasok. Then to the point, ikaw na ngayon naninira. Nung Katoliko pa ako, palahubog ako, all the kasamaan nung Katoliko pa. Ngayon, nandito ka sa ibang denomination, ganito na ako. And there are a lot of issues on this conflict. Next, the individual source of conflict. Sabi na natin, from within, our selfishness and then self, and there are a lot maliban doon. Okay? Maybe to our relationship with ourselves. There are times our mind, our heart, nag-aawa yan. It does not conform. Okay? Our mind and our heart, nag-aawa yan. Then, of course, another one, the family sources of conflict. The dysfunctional family, alam natin yan. Ito, nangyayari ito karamihan. Pag nag-abroad ang isa, pagbalik, napakasakit Kuya Eddie, di ba? Napakasakit, may awit tayo dyan, si Kuya Eddie, o Kuya Joars. Ano ay? Because of this dysfunctional family. Malayo ang isa, kaya nga long distance relationship. Advantages, kasi magkapera daw, but the disadvantages, yun yung tinitingnan, and that can become a source of conflict. Then another thing is national and international sources of conflict. So we know this one. Kayo mga police officers, to protect the country, to protect the people. But nowadays, palaging pasingitan kita sa Sa China. Okay lang yan. Nagpahinga lang kami dito, di ba ngayon? Hundreds of sasakyang pandagat nasa Palawan. Kasi aalis din kami. Pero pasingit yon. Okay? May nasabi bang government? Mayroon naman, pero hindi talaga. Ayaw man natin ng away, ganito kasi lang man tayo. Hulugan tayo ng bomba, mawala na tayo. Sabi, balik tayo doon sa International Tribunal. Sabi ni Carpio last night, babalik naman tayo doon kasi ito nang ginagawa nila. Nanalo na tayo, pero hindi man ino-honor. Pero our present administration, kasalanan na. But in fairness naman sa previous administration, nanalo tayo. Atin yun. Pero ngayon, friend man, sige. But sa atin, sa peace, we don't have war. Maganda yung usap tayo sa International Tribunal, dialogue, yun yung para ma-resolve yung conflict. That's more on international. What about national conflict? Marami tayo. Mayroon tayong mga kaliwa na mga grupo. That's within our country. Okay? Sige, we move on. There are other sources of conflict. Sabi ko, I told you, there are a lot. Pero, depende nga sa author. Organizational change. Ayaw mag-change. Remember, our organization, our government, dumating during the campaign, radical change. That's more the organization, the bureaucracy in the Philippines. Maraming gusto, maraming ayaw. Kaya nga, ang conflict nandoon. Then, different sets of values, alam natin yan. Kanya-kanya yan. Talaga, it can be a source of conflict. Then, contrasting perceptions. Ayun. Kanya-kanyang pananaw. So, therefore, may conflict. Then, personality clashes. Kanya-kanyang personality because we are unique. Then, threats to status. Pwede ba yun? Pwede. Halimbawa, on my end, dito sa amin, si Sir Joars, bakit na appoint ito as one of the heads sa grad school? kabago-bago sa polytechnic. Then minsan maririnig, ay dapat ano man yan. Well, that's threats on the status, especially to the employment. Okay? Pero in reality, yung iba, di ba, pinapatay, mag-director ka, mag-ano ka, patayin ka na lang kasi ako yung dapat nararapat. Then, the lack of trust, then the job-related issues, then the other agendas. Sabi ko, there are a lot when you talk about the sources of conflict. Well, in your report, babalik din ito. In your mga topic, babalik din yan. Sa araw naman, hindi mo ang tawag yan, madudla sa conflict na yan. Now, each one of us, we have a choice. Okay, we have a choice. After knowing those background about conflict, selfishness, and the other sa sinasabi ng mga well-known na mga tao, we have a choice. Okay, to resolve or to repeat the past conflict. So, it's up to us. Kaya nga, may past tayo, may future tayo. So, nasa atin talaga. Each person passes on either the problem or the solution. Kaya nga, in our course, once again, there are a lot of inputs, there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of later in your report, may mga resolutions sa mga problema. But once again, balik tayo dito, we have the individual choice, either to resolve or to repeat the past conflict. It's up to us. Okay? Then, does fighting resolve conflict? Kayo, mga police officers, mayroon kayong mga ideya dyan. Kaya sinasabi, fighting can be necessary, of course, for self-defense and to defend the weak. So, para ito sa inyo, mga officers, mga police. It's necessary for the two reasons, for self-defense as well as to defend the weak. Self-explanatory naman siguro yan. Then, fighting does not resolve conflict, whether we like it or not. Defeating an enemy does not answer his grievances or end his hatred. Defeating an enemy does not answer his grievances or end his hatred. What happened to Marawi? Naubos na daw ang mga ISIS at saka Damaute. Sabi dito, natapos ba yung hatred? Pero gayon, nagbi-build pa yan sila. Sinasabi nga, you cannot kill an ideology, but pwede mo siyang malamangan to have another ideology para makuha mo siya. Kasi ang hirap yon. Kahit na pinatay mo yun, talagang sa Cebuano magkatay-katay, nandyan pa rin yan, nag-i-exist pa rin yan. Like the NPA, na-indoctrinate na sila. Okay? Ubusin mo sila lahat, nandyan pa rin yan. Okay? Kahit ano pang gawin, nandyan pa rin because of the so-called ideology. Next, the defeated are tempted to seek revenge. So, ito na yun sa selfishness. Vengeance. The defeated are tempted to seek revenge. Then, the basis for conflict, if we want harmony, state of harmony, we have also the state of conflict. So, sabi kanina nga, it's up to us. We have our choice. Balik-balik lang yan. Look at the arrow. If we want state of harmony, pero baka bumalik ka rin doon sa state of conflict. Kaya nga, may nawala, may nare-restored din. The indemnity conditions efforts to revenge the process by which the original harmony was lost. Okay? Ikot-ikot. Pero baka dapat doon na sana tayo sa state of harmony. Kaya nga, nagpi-peace tayo. But kahit na peace, PhD, Doctor of Peace tayo, but it does not mean na wala itong conflict. Nandyan yun. Sabi ko nga sa atin, balance-balance lang. Okay? Yesterday, we had a seminar about conflict management din sa Davao. Mga lieutenant, mga major at saka kapitan yung aming mga audience. 265 sila lahat. Nandoon yung mga kababayan natin na estudyante ko dati dito sa JLC, ngayon mga lieutenant na, sila ni Kana, si Joe Malone ba yun, at saka the rest, nandoon sila. Then, one of the topic is all about this. Then, may taga-Samar. Dapat tayo, masigasig tayo, mga officers, ganito, ganyan. In order to resolve the so-called conflict, dapat individual approach gawin natin. Then, sabi namin, hindi pwedeng individual approach. We have to follow the government approach in order to resolve conflict. Kasi pag individual, baka mapahamak ka. Kasi yung iba parang very, very much engrossed after the lecture na talagang ma-resolve, magkaroon tayo ng peace. Okay, yun yung state of harmony, gustong-gusto. Pero, yun nga, wag lang magpadalos-dalos. Kahit na tayo, peace, doctor of peace kayo, wag magpadalos-dalos. Okay? Then, in the restoration of conflict, dapat ganon, sabi ko na sa taas, from selfishness to unselfishness. Dapat. Very ideal yan. Very ideal yan. Okay? From wrong to right, then from the broken relationship to a loving relationship. Pag nandoon na sana lahat sa taas, ingon pa ang uban, walay lami ang kinabuhi. Kasi walay ingredients, walay mga lamas. So therefore, pare-pareho na, puro na maano. So para may thrill ang kinabuhi, well, that's another perspective. But for us, especially sa peace, dapat no, nag-level up na tayo. From wrong to right, sir, magkamali man talaga tayo sapagkat tayo ay tao lamang. Well, kamali ka. Pero but we know, our hearts and our mind, dapat doon tayo loving relationship, the right one as well as the unselfishness. Hindi tayo manitili sa ubos, sa baba. The unbroken, the wrong as well as the selfishness. I think that's clear. Then there are steps. By the way, these steps, sabi ko nga, from your research, kasi bibigyan ko kayo ng mga topic, iba-ibang author, iba-iba yung banat. Pero dito sa na-research ko, there are also steps in the conflict resolution. The first one is the self-reflection and reorientation. From the word in itself, alam natin yan, self-reflection and reorientation. Consider how one might have dealt with the problem differently. Kung may conflict, may problema, tingnan nyo. In a different way, you have to reflect. Reorient. Yung there are times papasok yung the empathy. Kung ako kaya nasa kalagayan niya, nasa kanyang kalagayan, anong gagawin ko? Okay? Then, take responsibility for one's contribution to the conflict. Kaya nga, self-reflection as well as self-reorientation. Martin Luther King, familiar with this, a very well-known, patay na, pero yung the legacy na iniwan niya when we talk about peace, okay, when we talk about harmony, he said, we never get rid of an enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. Ganda sinabi, no? We never get rid of an enemy but meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. So, yun, ang ganda. Take note on that. Another number 2 steps, reversal or restitution. This is more on psychology. Yung baliktarin mo ba ang sitwasyon? Address whatever cause the other feel or hurt or violated. Then be open to efforts to reconcile. Then seek to correct the injustices. Halimbawa, knowing both sides. Kita mo kung if you are the mediator, anyway, papasok man tayo dyan with this conflict resolution, management, and transformation. Kung ikaw yung nasa gitna, may dalawang panig, alam mo ng side. So, pwede namang you will cite an option. I had my experience with this, yung conflict, especially when I was in the university. Pumunta kami sa Dole, minsan magkainitan na, tawagin kaming isang side. Sa admin, tinatawag sila. Ang ginagawa sa yung mediator, ano kaya? Kung ikaw nasa kalagayan nila, anong gagawin mo? O, dami ng ideya. Then after that, kausapin naman kami nasa negative side. Ano kaya? Then after that, magmi-meet kami. That's an example na reversal or the restitution na both sides, titingnan mo. Okay. Reconciliation and renewal. Give up claim for retaliation, kasi nga from the word reconciliation and renewal, then forgive and be open to receive forgiveness. It's more on talagang unselfishness na talaga ito kasi reconciliation as well as renewal. Resolve to help the other to change, then foster goodwill. Foster goodwill. Kaya nga minsan, kayo, in your experience, our experience, personal relationship, especially to our wife or to your husband, anong ginagawa? Di ba, minsan mayroon tayong mga goodwill. Kung mag-awa yan, pag naresolba yan, ang ganda. Date tayo uli, bi. Balikan natin yung nakaraan kung inumpisahan natin. Di ba ang ganda? Reconciliation, renewal. Yung especially the renewal. Balikan uli yung kagandahan. Okay? I think naintindihan man natin yan. Then there are also other detailed procedures, especially in conflict resolution. First, procedure. So I told you there are a lot, it depends on the author. Kaya nga, do not bear surprise in your report na bumabalik. So may iba naman na ibang paningin. Okay? So kagaya nito, meron ng iba, meron naman ditong procedure naman. Then the steps, first one is the primary or preliminary steps. These steps involves the knowing full details in the conflict, and the first thing to note is the stage of conflict. The more advanced the stage of conflict, the more efforts to require to resolve it. Moreover, strategy used is also dependent upon the stage of conflict. Kaya if you are the mediator, especially kayo, naranasan naman talaga nyo ito, kay mga officers naman kayo, alam na alam nyo ito, kahit na hindi natin i-discuss. Then, diagnosing the issue. Under this stage, the issues involved around should be analyzed and understood what the conflict is about. So, we have to know both sides. Okay? The positive, the negative, the hari at saka patay in a coin. Then, conflict handling modes. There may be numerous modes of conflict handling, and the group have into, like this one, avoid appearance of conflict, and the purpose of like-minded people should be appointed. Ayun, dapat tingnan ito in handling the conflict. Avoid appearance of conflict. Kasi may mga tao naman na hindi marunong, may kinikilingan ba? Dapat wala kang kinikilingan, sabi ni, sino yun? Rodriguez? Then, mediation. Another example of handling the modes of conflict. It involves sweeping out differences by mediation through persuasion, highlighting the merits and demerits of their cases. So, on your end, if you are the mediator, sana ma-resolve na. Yung gustuhin mo na hindi na lalaki, persuade mo maybe both sides. Kasi ganito, ganyan, ganyan, ganyan. Kung makaya mo, hindi na lalaki yung conflict, yung issues na yun. Then, letting the parties to settle their scores. Oh, okay. It is better when both the parties adopt a rigid stand to their lives. Okay na, may kasunduan nga. Minsan, di ba, nagsasign yan sila. So, yan. Silang dalawa. Settle nila. Anong score dito? Ano dito? Yung bang kay Stephen Covey, the win-win solution, nanalo siya, nanalo siya. So, nanalo kayong lahat. Hindi yung win-loss or loss-loss. So, problema yon. Then, mutual problem solving. This approach is suitable when both parties are interested in resolving conflict and are not rigid to their stand. Ang ganda ito. Mutual problem solving. So, hindi na natin ito palakihin. So, yun, pag-usapan na lang ng maayos. Okay? Sabi nga, this approach is suitable when both parties are interested in resolving the conflict and are not rigid to their stand. Kasi pag very rigid, astig-astig talaga yan sila, the isang side, wala talaga mangyari dyan. Okay? Kahit saan magkaabot, kahit nasa korte pa, kahit na mabilanggo pa ko, ano-anong gawin. So, yun, ganon. Pero pag mutual problem solving, dalawa, so hindi nalalawak yung conflict, yung issues. Then, actions that lead to peace. We mentioned this one already. Humility, admitting to not always being right. Then, being open to learn from others. That's humility. Sabi natin kanina, from the word humus, which means soil. Pagpakumbaba, because all of us came from the soil. Then generosity, giving beyond convenience, giving unconditionally without expectation in return. Kaya nga, nagbibigay ka na walang hinihintay na kapalit. That's generosity. Okay? You give without counting the cost. Hindi yung nagbigay ka, then may kapalit yon. Hindi dapat ganon. That's not being generous. That's more on selfishness. Okay? Service. Showing acts of caring to meet others' needs, then respecting the dignity of the recipient, reserving exploitation through service. Then, the greatest act of love, especially in winning over one's enemy, ito yon. Giving even to those who have done one harm. Convert the enemy into friend. So, ito yung isa sa issue na pinag-usapan namin sa mga officers. Converts enemy into friend. Kaya nga, I cited an example. You know, in North Cotabato, I think in Makilala, sabi ko, I'm a member of the Caranso. I think you're familiar with the Caranso. Maybe some of you are members of Caranso. And you know the history of Caranso. Okay? One of the police officers, I forgot the name, but he is a master sergeant. Okay? Kita niya ang mga NPA doon, naghahabal-habal. Sino ba yan naghabal-habal hanggang nagiging friends sila? So, yun yung nabuo yung history of the Caranso. Pwede pala. Convert the enemy into friend. Naging kaibigan sila. So ngayon, yung iba, nadadala niya nasa government stream na ngayon. So, wala nang gulo. Okay. Then, reverses ancient patterns of abuse and revenge. Okay. Reverses ancient patterns of abuse and revenge. So, that's another thing, yung the greatest act of love, winning over one's enemy. Balik na rin kaya natin, ganun lang. Yung sinabi natin kanina. Kung ikaw nasa kalagayan niya, especially Darido, biro mo yan, 30 years na kayo nagpapatayan kahit naiwalang mga inosente na damay-damay. So ano ngayon? In the future, ano mangyari? Sabi ko nga sa estudyante ko, kayo, mga bangsamoro man kayo nagrido, di maubos kayong bangsamoro kasi kayo, nag-uubusan kayo ng lahi. Paryente, magkapatid, mag-ama, nag-aaway dahil dyan sa pride na yan. Yung iba natauhan din. Kaya nga yun, i-revert. Then, according to Isa, I think majority of us here are Christians. I say to you, that's in Matthew, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, who cursed you. Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of the Father in heaven. That's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 to 46. So once again, our Lord Jesus Christ, sinabihan tayo, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who cursed you. Do good to those who hate you and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Ang dali sabihin, pero ang hirap ito gawin. Di ba may dagdag pa yan? If somebody slap you, paslap din sa kabila. If somebody throw you a stone, batuhin mo rin siya ng tinapay. Love your enemy. Very ideal. Love your enemy. There are a lot of examples here. And I think you're familiar with Pope John Paul II. Diba, inassassinate sana, binaril siya, natamaan siya. Hindi lang siya namatay. Anong ginawa? Nung gumaling siya, pinuntahan niya doon sa bilangguan. Pinapatawad niya. Nagiging friend niya yung enemy niya. That's an example. Tayo kaya? But well, sabi ko, we are all believers. I think the majority here are Christians. We believe Jesus and His teachings. So therefore, dapat take it or leave it. You have to follow the teachings. Pero hindi yan isang instansa. Isang ganun lang. May mga facing yan. Kasi sabi nga, tao tayo. Pero pag practically sundin mo yun siya, makaya man because we are all believers. Then Islam, may sinasabi din. Anong sinabi? According to the hadith, "My Lord, who is the greatest of thy servants in thy estimation?" What was the answer? "The one who forgives when he is in the position of power." Kung sinunod to sa mga pag-ari natin, walang rido. By the way, only in the Philippines na may rido. Wala namang rido sa ibang bansa, mga Muslim countries, Muslim areas. Pag may nasaktan, may namatayan, na disgrasya, to give justice para may peace, di ba? Blood money. Only in the Philippines na may rido. Kasi ito, sinusunod to sa iba. In the Philippines, wala. Magkamatayan man, magkuupusan ng lahi, hindi ito applicable sa kanila. Pero ito yung turo from the works and deeds of their Prophet Muhammad. Okay? "My Lord, who is the greatest of thy servants in thy estimation? The one who forgives when he is in the position of power." Then, what is needed? Kailangan tayo. Anong kailangan? We have the so-called leadership centered on true love. Okay. Ang hirap. Leadership centered on true love. "Sana'y pag-ibig na lang ang isipin ng bawat isa sa mundo. Sana'y wala ng away, sana'y wala ng gulo, sana may kapayapaan na if our leadership is centered on true love." Yun yung panawagan. Very ideal nga, pero hinay-hinay magagawa natin. Then, kailangan din ang ambassadors for peace. Kailangan din ambassadors for peace. Marami tayong mga ambassadors for peace. Pero I don't know kung may nagawa na. But tayo, we can be ambassadors for peace. It would start from our family to our work, then it will radiate to the whole world. And we can make a difference. We can be an ambassador of peace. And our leadership can be centered on true love. Okay? Then what about the attitude of an ambassador of peace? Kung pasado tayo dito. Show concern of both sides. Kung ikaw yung taga-mediate, then affirm the value of both sides. Gain trust from both sides that each is being treated fairly. Then aim for a win-win outcome. Yung sabi ni Stephen Covey nga. Remember the 7 habits of effective people? Okay. The win-win outcome. Then guide both sides beyond blame and accusation if you are ambassador of peace. Dapat alam mo ito. Then what about the mediation skills towards the offender? Help the offender accept the responsibility. Yan. Sino nagkasala? Alam mo kasi ganito, pero wag din yun pagalit. I-guide mo rin siya. Then, encourage admission of wrong. Mahirap yon, pero karamihan kasi sa tao ayaw marunong tumanggap sa kanyang kamalian. Hilig sa turo-turo. Pero sa turo, tinan nyo, bumabalik marami, isa lang doon sa kabila. Because ayaw tanggapin ang kamalian. Because of pride, because of maratabat. Okay? Help the offender accept the challenge of reconciliation. Avoid labeling or blaming. Itong labeling or blaming ba? Kasi ganito, mana ka kasi sa ano. Ang tatay mo, ang lolo mo, ganito. Mana, blaming. Okay? Then, praise the offender for a second chance. Okay? Praise and offer a second chance. Ang ganda. Diba? Love is sweeter in a second way around. Away-away sa mag-asawa. Then, after that, nag-reconcile, grabe, very sweet ang dating. Sana, masustain yung the sweetness. So, same is true with the both sides kung may conflict. Then, another thing, the mediation skills towards offended naman ito. Kanina offender, ngayon naman offended. Help the offended forgive and release grudges. Hindi din ito basta-basta ha. Help the offended forgive and release grudges. Then help the offended recognize own fault. So, Kahit na nasaktan ka, may mali din. Okay? Ano ay? In conflict, may dalawa talaga yung bagay. Sabi nga, kahit na it start from individual, may selfishness, may unselfishness talaga yon. Individual yon. How much more the groups of individuals? Okay? So, talaga, then, kahit na offended siya, may mali pa rin siya. Kaya nga minsan yung iba, idedma lang kung may conflict, hayaan na lang. Total, lilipas din yan. Di ba? Ang ganda naman pag gano'n. Lilipas din yan. Like ito mga chismis, hayaan mo lang chismis. Pag after that, wala kang ginawa. Pero pag pinatulan mo, grabe, puputok yan. Pero pag wala kang ginawa, hindi naman totoo. Nga sila. Okay? Sana all, pero hindi naman all. Kay tao tayo, grabe man because of the pride. Okay? Then, help the offended to accept an apology. Ayan. Sige, public apology kailangan ko, ganito, ganyan. Kung ganun man, nag-public apology siya, go. Then, foster harmony and friendship with the offender. That's a mediation skills towards the offended. Then, in promoting peace and reconciliation, ito, ginagawa din ninyo ito. Halimbawa, the service programs, meron kayo mga pulis dyan. Sports competitions, naalaala ko nga yung dito, yung nag-aral pa, ang the BF, the MILF, the military, the police, sports competition, then cultural programs, then dialogue between religions. Ito yung isa sa mga dapat gagawin natin, itong dialogue. Na pwede namang gawin ninyo yan. Maybe as a program sa inyong organisasyon, pwede yan. Like what we did in Notre Dame University, we have the so-called dialogue between religions. Then, women as peacemaker. Bakit kailangan ang kababaihan? Kasi iba yung feminine touch. Iba. Iba sila mag-isip. Iba kaysa sa atin mga kalalakihan. Yun din yung isa sa mga kailangan. Mahatma Gandhi. Familiar? Sino yung Mahatma Gandhi? National Hero of India? Na ang legacy niya is the non-active violence. I think you know the history. Then, according to him, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. Once again, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. Truth and love. Okay? That's also the mystery of the so-called love. The truth and love. Palagi yang nananalo. Okay? Kung nandyan yun. Okay? Because of his non-active violence. Okay? Yung, di ba, alam natin na history of Gandhi? In our history, in your readings, in-assassinate siya, di ba? But during his time, in India, di ba, lusubi na sana sila sa British Army. Anong ginawa with his disciples? They pray, they fasted. So, walang duguan na nangyari. Then, there are replicas all over the world. We have the EDSA dos, last month. Yung the EDSA. Last month, ginugunita natin. That's Unblood the Revolution, which is the replica also what Gandhi did during his time. Yun nga sa Hong Kong, yung mga young people, problema lang, may karahasan man nangyari. So, the love and truth, hindi nananalo. Kasi basta pag may karahasan. Then, Sadat Anwar. According to him, in his speech, any life that is lost in war is a human life. Be it an Arab or an Israeli. Innocent children who are deprived of the care and compassion of their parents are ours. They are ours. Be they living in Arab or Israeli land. Kasi because of the conflict in those countries, so atin yun, mga anak, for the sake of humanity. So ang ganda. So once again, any life that is lost in war is a human life, be it an Arab or an Israeli. Innocent children who are deprived of the care and compassion of their parents are ours. They are ours, be they living on Arab or Israeli land. I think the Secretary of UN noon, si Reverend San Myung Moon, may sinabi din siya. The reason why God does not punish an enemy is that He is thinking of an enemy's parents, wife, and children who all love Him. When you understand that heart of God, could you take revenge on your enemy? Ang bigat, ang ganda. The reason why God does not punish an enemy, that He is that He is thinking of the enemy's parents, wife, and children who all love Him. When you understand this, that the heart of God, could you take revenge on your enemy? So this is a great challenge. Then, what about the so-called conflict? Conflict can be defined in many ways. So, wala yung consensus definition ha. I told you, it depends on the author. At can be considered as an expression of hostility, negative attitudes, aggression, and misunderstanding. May emerge between different organizations or within an organizations. Be between organization or the social or the political environment. So, papasok yun conflict. Then, conflict is serious disagreement or argument between two or more persons. So, yan. Look at the image there, yung images. Disagreement. Then, according to the researcher, si Joe Kelly, conflict is defined as the opposition or dispute between persons, groups, or ideas. Then, si Foley, conflict is appearance of difference or difference of opinions and interests. So, they are more interrelated. Then, conflict is unavoidable. But we can learn to manage it. That's why this subject, meron tayong conflict resolution, management, and transformation. Because it's unavoidable, it's a natural phenomenon, nandyan talaga sa buhay natin, bahagian sa buhay natin. Kaya kakambal na sa buhay itong tinatawag nating conflict. But we can manage it. That's why we have this subject. Then, a condition that exists anytime two or more people disagree. Then, I told you it's a natural phenomenon, neither inherently good or bad, but there may be positive or negative outcomes. So one good thing, there may be positive outcomes and of course a negative outcomes. But as peace, we are more on the positive outcomes when we talk about conflict. Then there are nature of conflicts. Anyway, from your report, siguro babalik dito. In the nature of conflict conflicts are not big. Hindi naman masyado pag hindi palakihin. Then conflicts are multidimensional. Then when it comes to conflict fishing the balance, the conflict is universal, of course. It's universal. Then conflict is disruptive. Then conflict resolves disagreement. That's more on the positive outcomes of conflict. Then another views, there are views of conflict. So what about the views of conflict? In a traditional view, that's a research from 1930 to 1940. Take note on this view of conflict. The early approach to conflict assumed that all conflicts was bad. Conflict was viewed negatively and it was used with such terms as violence and destruction. That's a traditional view. Makaluma. It's bad. It's negative. That's from 1930 to 40s. Okay. Then, another view, the human relations view from 40s to 70s. Take note on this. Medyo nag-level up. Traditional, negative, talagang bad ang conflict. Dito naman, hinahinay nag-level up. The human relations position argued that conflict was a natural occurrence in all groups and organizations. Since conflict was inevitable, which cannot be avoided, it is accepted, and there are even times when conflict may benefit a group's performance. So it's more on human relation. So from very negative thing, dito naman, pwede naman. Okay, conflict may benefit a group's performance. So, hinay-hinay nag-level up when it comes to this view, the human relations view. Then what about the modern view? This view is based on the belief that conflict is not only a positive force in a group, but it is also necessary for a group to perform effectively. This approach encourages group leaders to maintain an ongoing minimum level of conflict, enough to keep the group viable, self-critical, and creative. So in the modern view na tayo na yan ngayon, so we have the responsibility as leader, as head. Tayong lahat, we are all leaders, especially kayo mga PhD na, in our own, may mga kliyente din tayo. So, maybe we can apply human relations as well as itong the modern view. Hindi naman talaga yung the traditional one na talagang ang conflict is bad. Once again, this approach encourages the group leaders to maintain an ongoing minimum level of conflict, enough to keep the group viable, self-critical, and creative. So, nasa kasalalay din sa atin, mga leaders. So, there are a lot of types of conflict. So, an example of this, yan. The functional and constructive conflict works towards the goals of an organization or group, which is constructive, increase information and ideas, encourages innovative thinking. That's more on constructive conflict or functional. So, hindi masyadong negative, constructive. Okay, functional. Then, what about this task conflict? The task conflict occurs when two parties are unable to move forward on a task due to a differing needs, behaviors, or attitudes. It can be conflict over organizational policies and procedures, distributions of resources, or the method or means of completing the task. Users have different needs. Kaya nga, paano itong task conflict? Siguro nangyari yon sa office ninyo. Kaya nga minsan in our application, yung job description, maganda din yon. Halimbawa, ikaw, administrative officer, ito yung job description mo. Baka, mag-overlap ka, masapawam yung iba, masasaktan yung iba, so, papasok na yung conflict. But if you are clear with the job description, ito yung limit ko. But it does not mean also that job description, dapat, your initiative would tell you, kung ang kasama mo nangangailangan ng tulong mo, ikaw wala ka nang ginagawa, tulungan mo. Para yung conflict na yun, mawala lang talaga. Kasi yung iba naman, ito lang job description ko, tapos pahayahay ka na. Nakita ng iba, ay, sobra naman, pareha yung sweldo natin. Ito, conflict, nag-arise din. Okay? So, nasa sa atin din yon. It's more on the task conflict. Then, what about the relationship conflict? Relationship conflict is a conflict resulting from either personality clashes or the negative emotional interactions between two or more peoples. Nangyayari ito sa mag-asawa, magkaibigan. Kaya nga, sabi nga, the best friend daw is the best enemy. Kasi because of this relation conflict, well, may topic tayo dyan. Somebody mag-report dyan about that, how to resolve the relationship conflict. So, the levels of conflict, individual, group, as well as organizational. So, under sa individual, the intra, at saka the enter. Under sa group, we have the intergroup conflict and the intra Then enter sa organisasyon, ganun doon, the inter at saka intra-organizational conflict. Once again, lalabas pa din yan sa mga reports ninyo. So what about this intra-individual conflict? Intra is within. Okay? Inter naman doon sa iba. So this is an internal conflict that involves struggle between the character, his or her opinion. So kaya nga intra. This has to do with the individuals having to make choices between wrong or right, or even with overcoming emotions or mixed feelings. So, nasa sayo na. Kaya nga, intra, self. Example, a father or mother tries to make a decision whether he or she is to stay with the family or to take a job and in another place or another country to get a better life for the family. So, yan. Usap sila. That's within the family. Kung ma-resolve yan, kasi yung isa, wag na lang kasi magkuhan ka na sa mga bata. Sabi na may isa, kulang mo yung income mo para masustain yung ating pangailang araw-araw, kailangan ko. Pero pag nagpausapan yan, that's more on the family, intra, within the family. Okay? What about enter or external conflict? Enter, may iba naman. Okay? Inter-individual conflict is a character man struggles against his outside force such as nature, physical obstacle, or another character. Okay. Ako, yun. May conflict ako, tingnan nyo, with the struggle of force such as your nature, the physical obstacles, or another character. Kanina within, ngayon, external, may sangkot naman na nasa galing labas. Then what about this character versus character? A character struggling against another character, mental or physical. Example, two persons fighting. Yan, character to character. That's an example. Then, character or sa tao versus nature. What about this? A character is struggling with the forces of elements of nature, natural disaster, flood, etc. that is beyond his or her control but struggle usually done for survival. Example dito. With this natural calamity. Anong conflict yan versus nature? Minsan wala kang magagawa. Yung iba nga, landslide. Dito yung bahay nila, kalaban nila is nature. Pero napansin ninyo, you have the subject before environmental care. Sinisira kasi ng tao ang nature. Kaya nga tayo, na kasalanan ng tao. So therefore, bumabalik, gumaganti yung nature. Kaya nga, conflict within. Pero ang tao magsabi man, wala tayong magagawa. Kasi ang kalikasan may sarili ding nature sila. Ito yung mga sinasabi nila. Next. Man versus society. Ito, marami yan. The character versus society. The struggle between a character or a group of characters fighting against the rules or laws that govern the society in which he or she lives. Example, religion and politics. Ngayon, in our government today, anong sabi sa atin, especially kaming Katoliko? Anong klaseng God? Your God is a stupid God. Sa creation story, na hindi naman alam kabuuan, gumagawa ka ng tao tapos ganito pahirapan mo yung tao. Your God is really a stupid God. Religion and politics. Man versus society. Ito namang mga Katolikong iniidolo, ayaw na magsalita to stand up for injustices and the human rights violation. Sunod ng sunod. Kasi ato ni, taga Mindanao ni. Kaya nga sa peace, there are very, very unpeaceful mga scenarios. Mga negative na mga sinasabi, kabastusan. Ako as peace. Sabi ko, unsahay, siguro gisio na lang na ako ang akong diploma ba sa peace, sa Doctor of Peace. And why? We are bombarded with all this news, very negative. Pero itawa na lang. Because according to Mother Teresa, peace begins with a smile. Smile mo na lang. Smile when your heart is aching. Smile when your heart is breaking. Iyon na lang for the sake of peace. Pero yun, ang sakit talaga ito. biro mo yan, my God is stupid God. But well, he will face judgment on the day of judgment. Doon niya malalaman. Doon niya malalaman. I have my God, but my God is different from your God. Doon niya malalaman kung sino yung God niya. Baka si Satanas yun. Okay, we are not judging, pero man or character versus society. Okay, pero sana naman ngayon matauhan na. Minsan, pag magsalita kasi mga kaparian namin, may ano kaagad, banat agad. 'Di ba? Alam natin may tatlong mga obispo na may mga threat. Bishop David, Villegas, si Pabilio ngayon nakasali, si Cruz, namatay naman si Bishop Cruz. Then, mga kaparian, may tatlong pari. The very well known, the sikat. Sabi, sumusubra si Father Robert Reyes, ganito, ganyan. Yun yung pinag-usapan din namin sa seminar sa mga officers. Sabi ko, well, if you look at the scenario, may tama ba siya? May mga tama siya. Kung may mali man, sabi na, kung may mali man, brother, dapat sinasabi din niya yun. Pero sabi ko, well, there are confidentialities. Dapat you look at the broader picture. Sa Davao, meron ding pari isa, di ba may threat din si paring Robert? Okay, si paring Bert. But well, that's more on religion and politics. Kasi sabihan agad, you work for God, you work for your church, and not for the country. Pero sabi ko nga, paano na lang ang mga sidulan nila? Are they not citizen of this country? Nagkataon lang taong simbahan sila. May karapatan din sila magsalita. What they are saying is not all about the church, it's about the issue on politics. Pero hindi man maintindihan yun ng tao. Okay? Pero sa tayo for the sake of peace, intindihin natin yung mga parian na yun. Kahit na yung iba sumusubra. Okay? Mga kabaro ko man sa sumusubra. Okay? Pero, tingnan mo din yun. I-balance lang. Pero yung iba, anong klaseng pare? Negative na. Doon ka balik sa traditional. Okay? Kasi alam natin na ngayon, ang ating Pangulo, hindi magpasabi. Okay? Pagsabihan mo, balikan ka kaagad. I-personal ka. In fairness naman, I'm not pro-Robredo. In fairness naman sa kanya, and I don't know with you, baka mag-against kayo sa akin, may nagawa din siya. Hindi yun yung below the belt na mag-aral ka, anong klase kang ito, bugo ka, mag-refresh ka ng law mo na subjects. Is that good? Mas lalong kinikreate yung conflict din. Pag mag-discuss naman o mag-storya, di ba, yung tukhang, dapat, ginawa siyang czar. Nung ginawa, tinanggal din. Bakit tinanggal? Hindi ko nagustuhan yung ginawa mo. Nakipag-alyansa ka sa mga big companies. Kasi the intention of Robredo para makukuha yung mga big drug dealer, yung kung saan nagagaling yung drug. Kasi ang pinapatay naman, alam nyo mga pulis, mga pobre. Okay? That's the reality. Okay? Religion versus society versus politics. Mga pare nga mag-istorya about this against the tukhang, talagang sila tuloy balikan, banatan na may mali. Sila ang mali. Human rights, kawawa man ang human rights, di ba? Dapat buwagin na doon Duterte yung office ng human rights kasi gobyerno man din nagsweldo sa kanila. Kung ayaw niya magpasabi. Okay? But well, that's politics. Kaya nga, religion and politics, mag-away talaga yan. Okay? Sa atin, for the sake of peace, hanggang komentaryo lang tayo, but in our own way, we know what is right, what is wrong. Okay? Then, the intragroup conflicts or within the group refers to the disputes among some or all the group's members, which often affects the group's performance. Ayun naman, kung nasa within that organization, within that group, talaga makaka-apekto yan. Then, the intergroup conflicts between groups naman arises out the interaction of various groups. The intergroup conflicts refers to the conflict between groups, the departments between groups is frequent and highly visible. In your organization, the police organization, di ba? Kanya-kanyang department din yan. Nagko-conflict kaya? May tinatawag kaya tayong the intergroup conflict? Or sa academe, kanya-kanyang colleges or department din yan. Mayroon bang intergroup conflicts? Meron. Okay? Meron. Okay. Pero dapat sa atin, how to resolve those conflicts, tayo na yon. Tayo yung mangunguna dyan. Kayo, bilang mga peace educator, mga peace doctors in the future. Malapit na. Hindi nyo mamalayan, madodoktor na din kayo. Then the intra-organizational conflict, the conflicts arises within the various levels of the department and of organizations like horizontal conflict, yan mangyayari yan, vertical, horizontal, vertical conflict, ganun yung mangyayari. Then in the inter-organizational conflict naman, interaction results in the conflict among different organizations. However, it is not necessary that such interaction may result to conflict. Ayan, ito naman. However, it's not necessary that the interaction may result to conflict. It's good to interact, pero not necessarily may conflict agad. Then the most common conflict occurs in an organization, ito. Kung may conflict, mayroong lockouts, may strikes, issues related with performance appraisals, resistance to change, then conflict related with emotions, then conflict due to frustrations. Yung the most common conflict occurred in an organization. So with this, I'd like to end this presentation. So in our group chat, I'll just assign you a topic about our course, of course. Then I hope you learn something. Then as an output of this presentation, I'll just post it in our group chat. So I hope you learn something. And thank you for listening. Mabuhay tayong lahat. God bless you all. Dalaygon ang Diyos.